This is a Rogue Media Network podcast.
Do you ever have a story that you just can't get out of your head?
One that you play the details of over and over with your friends?
Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Claire.
And I'm Susan.
And this is Justice Pending,
a weekly true crime podcast where we discuss tantalizing crimes with more questions than answers.
Hey, welcome back to Justice Pending, the podcast where we dive into unsolved cases, legal twists, and the mysteries that keep us up at night. I'm Claire.
And I'm Susan. And today we're tackling a case that's frustrating, heartbreaking, and full of unanswered questions. The deaths of Nichol Olsen and her two daughters, Alexa and London.
Yes, this case takes us to the Anakawa Springs Ranch subdivision in San Antonio, Texas, where on January 10th, 2019, Nichol and her daughters were found dead in her boyfriend's home. And let me tell you, Susan, from the start, the facts just don't add up in this one.
No, they do not. It was initially ruled a murder-suicide. But as we peel back the layers, things get murkier. And honestly, this is one of those cases that makes me want to grab a corkboard and start connecting red strings.
I support that. I'll bring the push pins. Let's get into it.
All right, let's set the scene. Nichol Olsen, a 37-year-old mother of three, was found dead alongside her daughters, Alexa, who was 16, and London, who was just 10. All three had been shot. Her boyfriend, Charles Wheeler, claims he found them after spending the night elsewhere.
Yes, and get this. He says he left the house after a fight with Nichol the night before. And the next morning, he goes back, calls 911, and tells authorities he's found them all dead.
I mean, that is just a little bit suspicious to me.
Yes, and when the autopsies come back, the Behar County medical examiner ruled Nichol's death a suicide, but the girls' deaths, homicides.
That immediately raises some questions for me, because if you talk to her friends and family, none of them believe she would harm her kids, let alone herself.
Yeah, it's a really horrific thing to take a life, any life, but to imagine that she was in such a dark place that she would actually, theoretically, allegedly murder her own children?
Yeah.
And then kill herself. This is just not something that mothers really do. This is extremely rare for women to use a firearm to commit a violent crime, much less one against their own family or themselves. So, here's another detail that's been shared publicly. When deputies arrived, Charlie was supposedly crying outside, but they noted in their report that there were no visible tears.
Okay. So we've got a dry cry situation.
Yep, we sure do. That's not always a smoking gun, but when you combine it with other details like smeared blood on the walls, a disabled security system, and 5 calls from Nichol's phone to 911 the night she was killed, it starts to look really sketchy. So, yeah, Nichol's phone had tried to connect to 911 5 times. And these calls didn't go through. She didn't actually talk to a 911 operator, but on her call record, you can see that she attempted to call 911 5 times. So, was she personally in a place where she was trying to reach out for help? Or, was someone else using her phone? Was she reaching out for help because she was struggling with demons or because she was in a situation where she felt unsafe? It's just really disturbing. And, it started to remind me in a lot of ways about the Michelle Williams case. She was the one who called 911 when her husband was shot and killed. And the deputies there also noted that she had a dry cry, that she was hysterical, that she was making all the sounds of a person crying, but they never saw any tears. So shameless plug for season 3 of Final Days on Earth. But this dry cry comes up again and again where suspects are trying to make themselves appear more sympathetic than maybe they would if they weren't crying at all.
So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't look good when the dry cry never works. We always know, right? Um,
Well, I mean, and people have different reactions to
sure.
grief. I think that's something that officers talk about a lot. When I was a producer for 48 Hours on CBS, we would interview law enforcement about how suspects behaved in the moments after they found out that their loved one had died. And some people will immediately start crying and the tears will come. Some people are just in shock and they just sort of go catatonic and appear to have no reaction, but they're actually processing this completely unbelievable piece of information. And, you know, I don't know if a dry cry is a sign of guilt or if it's maybe an attempt to say, um, I know I should be crying, but I feel nothing. So I'm going to attempt to make myself cry.
Right.
It's,
Defense mechanism, but you
yeah,
don't just so you don't know what to do. Yeah. Yeah, it could be. So despite the medical examiner ruling, the sheriff's office brings in the FBI. I guess they didn't believe it either.
yeah.
And the case is actually still open to this day. So investigators really were starting to look into whether this was a triple homicide instead of a murder suicide.
Yeah, a lot of times in cases that I've covered, as soon as the medical examiner gives a suicide ruling, pencils down. The investigation stops, right?
Right.
That is a clear out for law enforcement if they want to take it. They can rule it suicide. And then the other two cases, obviously, were homicides, but they can attribute that to the person who had committed suicide. So as crazy as it is to say, it's actually a clean, law enforcement interaction to close all those cases in one fell swoop. With just a few strokes of the pen, they can end everything. But they didn't do that, and the sheriff has been very vocal about how he's continuing to look into all options. And so, we have to talk about Charlie Wheeler. He's technically not a suspect, but he is a person of interest. So law enforcement has been careful to classify him as a person of interest. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it was a suicide ruling. And so they don't want to overstep. They don't want to give, the appearance that he committed a crime, but he is a person of interest for this case. And, he has an alibi. He says he stayed at a relative's house the night that Nicole and her daughters died. Um, and so that's his story, and he's sticking to it. It was his house. So this house where they were killed, belonged to Charlie. It did not belong to Nicole, and she'd been living there with her daughters. She also has an older son who's an adult, and he was, living on his own. But they had been living there, and he left them alone in the house is his story. Now, the fact that he's at a relative's house for his alibi, you can look at that and say, well, the relative would corroborate that.
Yeah. I mean,
Blood is thicker than water.
mm,
The idea that's not as good of an alibi as checking into a hotel, for example. But nonetheless, that's his alibi. So even with the suicide ruling and him having someone to account for his whereabouts, authorities still pulled his phone records and impounded his truck.
which, I have to commend this sheriff for not putting the pencils down as you said earlier, and really wanting to get this solved and saying, something smells a little fishy here. We're not going to stop until we have answers. I think that's really commendable that they are not taking the easy way out on this. But also, why? Okay, Wheeler, if you're totally innocent, like, why are they seizing your vehicle? I mean,
Yeah,
he had to be sweating his collar a little bit.
definitely would never make you feel good for authorities to impound your vehicle in a murder investigation. So, something that came up through the investigation is that Nicole had recently been looking at new apartments. She had been touring apartment complexes and looking for 3-bedroom units. And so the idea that she was happy in the relationship with Charlie started to come into question because why would she be moving out? This was a large home in a very wealthy, desirable subdivision in San Antonio. Plenty of room. No reason why she would need to move into an apartment if the relationship was going well. So that sort of, cast some more aspersions on a possible motive for the deaths. And it also made people say that, she was making plans. She was planning for the future. She was planning for a new life and doesn't sound like someone, who's going to end their life if they're looking at new apartments and trying to, sign a lease.
Yeah, no, no. That sounds like a woman trying to start over.
So there's some more red flags. So I think we should run through the things that make us go, hmm.
Okay.
Nicole was making future plans.
Mhm.
Um,
I heard that.
yeah, as we've stated, she seemed to be very much looking out for her daughters, looking out for herself. Her friends and family insist that she wasn't suicidal, and this is a woman who's very close to a lot of people. So this comes up often in cases that are ruled suicide that people don't see it coming, and that part of it is the nature of mental illness. That it
Mhm.
is a lot of times something that people struggle with privately
Yeah.
and that they won't admit to anyone, besides themselves. And so, that's a tough one. That's a tough one to say. But it definitely does come up again and again just how um vivacious, Nicole was and how ambitious she was and how much she loved her daughters and that she didn't show any signs of mental illness, at least not that her friends and family, have ever shared publicly. Um, something that really troubles me at the house is the fact that the security system was disabled.
Mhm.
So there's actually an elaborate security system, cameras, door notifications, window notifications, and it's all turned off the
Huh.
night that she's killed. So
Yeah,
the
that's
night that
sketchy.
Charlie leaves the house, the security system has been disabled, which is another thing. Like you're leaving your girlfriend and two stepdaughters, I guess they weren't married, but you're leaving your girlfriend and her two children alone in your house and you're going to disable the security system when you leave?
I
That
mean, he was it, wires cut at the entrance, or was it physically turned off from the home location?
My understanding is that it was physically turned off from the home location. Yeah,
Wow.
electronically turned off. It wasn't
That
like
is not
hacked to pieces. Yeah.
that is not a good look for a Wheeler.
Yeah, it's something that has definitely raised a lot of eyebrows. The idea that the crime scene, didn't look like a cut and dry murder suicide, just the fact that there was smeared blood on the walls,
Yeah. Oh.
that's odd. People have um also discussed that the bodies were in odd positions. Again, this is an open, active investigation, so a lot has not been disclosed.
Mhm.
But authorities are very clear that they have reason to continue investigating this. And let's not forget those 911 calls that were made from Nicole's phone but didn't connect.
Right. Right. And I've also, it's also been said that the biological fathers of the girls, of Nicole's daughters, say that Wheeler never made an effort to introduce himself or be involved in their lives. So it does seem there's a disconnect for
Yeah.
sure somewhere in this relationship.
Yeah, he's kind of the mysterious figure. People didn't know a whole lot about him. They, had these sort of lovely, glamorous photos on social media. Nicole and Charlie did, and they looked like a picture perfect couple. But a lot of people had doubts about him, and many of them said that they worried about him. Even before the murder, which hindsight's 2020. You say that
Right.
now, but that has come up that, her friends have raised concerns about him.
Yeah, I mean, what struck me as odd is that if you have moved your girlfriend in with her daughters, with her family, I mean, it's just odd because if you're co-parenting, which I believe she was actively and
Right.
nicely, I mean, there was, I'm sure there was issues, but the fathers were still in the picture. So it was just sort of strange that you would, like you said, like appearances, right? Like you are so
Yeah.
nice, you move your girlfriend in, you let her daughters move in too. I mean, it's all just one big happy family, and now she's looking for apartments, and maybe it's not, what social media would have you believe. And then after the murders, Charlie never reached out to the families, never offered condolences, nothing.
That's what they've said. They've said
Yeah.
that they never heard from him, that they didn't get, sort of the standard "I'm sorry for your loss" type
Yeah.
statement. Of course, we don't know that personally, but that is what is been stated by the victims' families. So I think they have felt, that there are a lot of unanswered questions in their relationship and in his, reaction to this horrific crime that took place in his home, which, I think is just a lot to process for anyone. So, there's so much here. I think when you look at this case, we have to talk about the fact that women rarely use a gun to commit suicide. Statistically speaking, that's a man's method of choice. Women were more often to use pharmaceuticals
Mhm.
if they're going to attempt to end their own life. And, it's like 55% of men will use a gun and only 30% of women do. So that stood out to me as just um, something that was a red flag for me, just the method. Other than the fact that, of course, her 2 daughters, like, that's just so beyond the normal, experience for, even women in distress. Just if they're going to kill their children, God, it's, like, so horrible to even think about. But you look at, you know, where this usually happens is, like, typically, like, postpartum depression.
Right, it's not
It's
younger kids, it's not teenagers
yeah,
or preteen. Yeah, I
and
know.
it
I mean,
it's yeah,
it's horrible.
it's so terrible, to think about because no matter what, no matter what happened in this, there's no question that, Alexa and London were murdered. Like, that happened, and the idea that they had this violent end in their own home, um, is just so sad. And it's something that the community in San Antonio, they've come together for multiple vigils, candlelight ceremonies. They've done things to remember these girls and to try to get answers. So, fast forward, the case is still ongoing. The sheriff's office keeps saying they have unanswered questions and they won't stop until, they get the answers that they're looking for. Um, they brought in the FBI. There's been a push for the Texas Rangers to take over, but nothing's happened yet, at least not publicly.
Yeah, and, London's family has been advocating for red flag laws, behind the scenes, which would allow authorities to temporarily take guns away from people deemed a risk to themselves or others.
Yeah, and I wanted to also talk about the fact that this gun that was used, I was not able to find any information on who it actually belonged to. I think people have assumed that it belonged to the owner of the home, but I haven't seen that stated anywhere. Whose gun it was, what kind of gun it was. That's interesting to me, just because the idea that if this was Nicole's gun, that would certainly answer some questions. And I wonder where it was kept. A lot of people in Texas have guns. Like, that is a given. Most people have them in a gun safe. And so was this a gun safe that Nicole had access to? Was this something with, a combination lock? Was there a fingerprint scanner? How did this gun normally, you know, exist in this home? Was it just out? Some people, put them under the pillow. Some people put them in the nightstand. I've seen everything. Covering these cases for CBS News for so long. Some people really do just leave guns laying out in the house, as frightening as that is to think about.
Mm.
But the idea that whenever people are having some type of mental crisis, um, that they would still have access to guns, I think is disturbing for a lot of people. I know that's a huge conversation with a lot of nuance, and people will have all sorts of opinions about that. But I think the fact that London's family is using her death to try to prevent other instances of gun violence is commendable.
It is. And, you think about just something that popped into my head, the potential for the crime scene to have been staged as a suicide reminds me of Damien Hird's
Yeah.
case, which you covered in, Final Days on Earth season 1, and how medical examiners can get it wrong or people can question them. It's interesting to me that they've never reversed their initial conclusion.
Yeah, and from what I've seen in other cases that have been closed, and the autopsies and medical examiners reports are public. A lot of times if it's a suicide, it's because it's like a contact wound. It's because it's in the, dominant hand on the dominant side.
Mhm.
And they look at all these things to say, if this was self-inflicted or not, because it's actually pretty hard to get up close to a person and you know commit this murder in a contact wound way. It's not impossible. Certainly people can be overpowered, and that can happen, but the way in which she was shot has led experts to say that it was self-inflicted.
Wow. I mean, there's got to be forensic evidence that could be reexamined, cell phone data, vehicle tracking, geofencing. I mean, there's so much out there that I'm sure the police are looking into. I'm glad they haven't closed the case, but it's been a while now.
Yeah. So yeah, this was 2019. We're in 2025 as we sit here today. So it's been 6 years, and people wonder, if they'll ever get justice and ever get answers for Nichol Olsen and her daughters.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder too, you
The
know.
longer it drags out, the harder it gets. Memories fade, evidence degrades, people move on. But I think it's one of those cases where one day someone is going to say something, and it'll break this case wide open.
I mean, I do hope that happens.
Yeah, the slip of the tongue, people can always hold on to hope for new information to come to light.
Totally. And before we wrap this episode up, what's your gut feeling?
So I definitely think there's way more to this story. It's possible that Charlie Wheeler wasn't directly involved, but I think something happened in the house that night and we don't have the full picture. I think if, we could know what their conversation was about, if we could know where you know, Nicole and her daughters were in the house, what if we had a timeline, if we had a TikTok, I think we could know a lot more than we do today. And gosh, I just wish that security system hadn't been disabled.
Well, I mean, that's just one of the crazy pieces of the puzzle. But yeah, I'm with you. I can't really shake the feeling that Nicole didn't do this. Too many inconsistencies. The psychology doesn't work for me. All that.
Yeah. And, we'd love to know what listeners think. If you have thoughts, theories, or actual information, because hey, stranger things have happened. You can reach out to us at justicepending.com or to the Behar County Sheriff's Office.
Yeah. Or, we love a good theory. Tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, always ready to listen. Justicepending.com. So that's it for today's episode. Make sure to follow us on social media and let us know what you think of this case.
Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and keep questioning everything.
Especially murder suicide rulings that don't make sense.
Correct.
Justice Pending is recorded in Dallas, Texas for Rebel Studios. It's hosted by me, Claire Sanama, and Susan Passoni. Our theme music is Bending Truth, licensed at premiumbeat.com. We appreciate all listener feedback. Leave a review wherever you're listening right now, and we might read it on the air.
This has been a Rogue Media Network production.